It started as soon as I stepped through the front door of my new house. A sudden, heavy silence that settled over everything. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring as if they're trying to fill in the emptiness with something. Anything. It was my first night alone here, after finally moving all my things in that day. The furniture was still half-wrapped, boxes scattered across the floor, yet there was something in the air that felt wrong. The house itself wasn't old, but it had a certain stillness that seemed strange. No creaks, no hum from the fridge. Even the hum of the power lines outside seemed to fade as I closed the door behind me. Standing in the middle of the living room, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, an almost instinctual urge to turn and walk right back out. But it was my house now, so I brushed it off and started unpacking. I tried to keep myself busy, shuffling around, setting things up. I had just finished putting together my bed when I noticed something odd. There were faint footprints on the carpet in the hallway. Bare, human footprints that hadn't been there earlier. At first, I convinced myself it was some dust pattern, something I must have tracked in. But I couldn't ignore that they seemed too small for my feet, too narrow and delicate. And they led straight to the master bedroom, the room I'd be sleeping in that night. I shook it off, blaming my tired mind, and decided to grab a drink from the kitchen. But when I turned the corner, there was another surprise waiting. My kitchen lights were flickering, a slow, methodical pulse that had no reason or rhythm. I thought it was probably an electrical issue from the move. But the lights dimmed one final time, casting the room in a weak, orange glow, just bright enough to show something lying in the center of the floor. A key. One I hadn't seen before, long and rusty. The kind of thing you'd find in an attic of an ancient house, not a modern suburban home. Curiosity overtook me, and I picked it up. The metal was cold, impossibly so. My fingers tingled, and a feeling crept up my spine, one that was hard to shake. I didn't know where the key led, but it seemed to weigh my hand down, heavy with some unspoken dread. I tried to focus on something else, but as the hours ticked on, the sounds began. Low, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the walls. I searched for the source, pressing my ear to each surface, walking from room to room, only for the tapping to move, always staying just out of reach, as if it were shifting through the house to avoid me. It was almost mocking. The worst part was the mirror in the hallway. Every time I passed by, I'd catch a glimpse of something strange in it. It was my reflection, but wrong. Its movements were just a bit off. If I took a step, my reflection took two. If I blinked, it stared right back at me, eyes dark and void. Once I thought I saw it smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched far too much. By then, the air had grown thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to head up to bed, thinking maybe sleep would ease whatever was happening. But as I climbed the stairs, I felt a sudden chill, so cold that my breath came out in visible puffs. And then, as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, its form a distorted shadow that flickered as if it were part of the dim lighting. Its eyes were hollow, deep pits that stared straight at me, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, it didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as though daring me to approach. I don't know how long I stood frozen, but eventually, I forced myself to turn and go back down the stairs, all the way back to the front door. I tried the handle, pulling and tugging, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. The key I'd found earlier was gone from my pocket, vanished as if it had never existed. The shadow was gone when I turned around, but I knew it hadn't left. It was somewhere, waiting. Every room I passed seemed darker than it should have been, and when I finally got back to the kitchen, I noticed something on the counter. A note I hadn't left there. "Welcome home," it read, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Beneath it, there was a small, worn-out notebook. I opened it, fingers trembling, and began to read. The first few pages were filled with desperate entries, each one dated years ago, from someone who'd lived here before me. The last entry sent a chill through my entire body. "I can't leave. It won't let me. It wants me to stay, to replace me. If you find this, know it's too late. You're already part of it." Just then, the lights went out completely, and the tapping in the walls grew louder, surrounding me from all sides. There was no escape, no way out. All I could do was sit in the darkness, listening to the tapping grow closer and closer until it was right beside me. A whisper in my ear, a shadow waiting just beyond sight. And as the silence settled over me once more, I finally understood. I wasn't alone in the house. I never had been. I don't know how long I sat in the dark, frozen. The air was so thick it felt like something was pressing down on my shoulders, weighing me into the floor. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, each thud a drumbeat to the maddening silence. But then I heard something that pulled me out of my daze. Footsteps. They were faint at first, a soft padding sound coming from upstairs. I gripped the edge of the countertop, unsure if I should stay put or try to make a break for it. Every instinct in me was screaming to run, but the footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing down the stairs as though they were being drawn to my fear. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky, and stumbled toward the nearest room, the living room. I crouched behind the couch, holding my breath, listening to the steady, unhurried steps. Whoever or whatever was coming down the stairs wanted me to hear it, as if savoring the fear building in me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would pass by, that it wouldn't know where I was hiding. The footsteps slowed as they reached the bottom of the stairs, pausing at the threshold between the hallway and the living room. I could feel its presence like a weight in the room. Every hair on my neck stood up, my skin crawling with a primal fear. Then came a voice, a low, hoarse whisper that sent chills straight through me. "I know you're here." The voice was wrong. It sounded twisted, like a broken record playing over an old, rusted speaker. It was close, too close, and as the words hung in the air, I could feel a coldness seeping toward me, like fingers reaching out to touch me. I pressed my back against the couch, trying to melt into it, and then silence. The voice stopped, and so did the footsteps. I held my breath, waiting, terrified of making a sound. After a long pause, I heard it moving again, this time toward the front door. I dared to peek over the edge of the couch. The figure was standing by the door, its back to me. It looked almost human, but its shape was all wrong. Its spine twisted at impossible angles. The arms were unnaturally long, fingers tipped with dark, claw-like nails that scraped lightly against the door. My stomach turned, and I felt bile rising as I watched it. It tilted its head, almost as if listening, and I took the moment to inch back, hoping I could escape to the back door or maybe a window. But as I moved, the floor creaked under my weight. I froze, but it was too late. The figure's head snapped around, and I saw its face, or what should have been a face. There were no eyes, only hollow pits that seemed to pull the darkness into them. Its mouth was stretched wide, far too wide, and it grinned, exposing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a low, guttural growl and began to shuffle toward me, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. I ran. I didn't look back. I just bolted toward the back of the house. But as I reached the kitchen, the lights flickered, and suddenly, the whole house was filled with the deafening sound of that tapping, now echoing from every wall, every corner. It was so loud, so relentless, I had to cover my ears as I ran. I reached the back door, fumbling with the lock, my fingers trembling so much I could barely get a grip. Finally, I managed to twist it, pulling the door open, only to find that it led into darkness. Not my backyard, not the street, just nothing. A black void stretched out before me, swallowing everything. I backed away, my stomach dropping, realizing that escape was impossible. The tapping grew louder, and I turned to see the figure standing in the hallway, watching me with those empty, hungry eyes. Its head tilted, its mouth twisting into that horrific grin again. "You're home," it whispered, voice dripping with malice. "And I'm just getting started." I scrambled back into the kitchen, desperately looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a knife lying on the counter. I grabbed it, clutching it tight, as the figure moved closer, its limbs stretching and contorting as it moved, filling the hallway, blocking any chance of escape. But then, something changed. The lights flickered again, and for a brief second, I saw something behind the figure. Another face, just as twisted and empty, hovering in the darkness, and then another and another. They were layered on top of each other, faces upon faces, each one more horrifying than the last. As if every person who had ever set foot in this house was still trapped here, part of the entity, feeding it. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that the house itself was alive. It was feeding off my fear, my helplessness, drawing me deeper into its grasp. And as the entity reached for me, its claws extended, I knew I was next in line to become part of its endless, hollow hunger. In a desperate last act, I lunged forward with the knife, slashing at its outstretched hand. The blade met resistance, cutting through something solid yet cold as ice. The figure recoiled, hissing, and in that moment, I saw an opening. A door that hadn't been there before, cracked open at the far end of the kitchen, spilling dim, flickering light into the darkness. Without thinking, I sprinted for it, throwing myself through the doorway just as the lights went out completely. I fell forward, landing on cold, hard ground, and when I looked back, the door was gone. I was outside, lying in my front yard. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I sat there for a long time, too afraid to move, to breathe. As I sat in the grass, staring at my dark, silent house, the gravity of what had just happened began to settle over me like a weight. I was outside. I had made it out. The night was cold, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth, and I could feel the dew soaking into my clothes. I didn't care. I was out of that place, away from whatever horror lurked within. But then, as my breaths began to steady, something caught my attention. The front door, which I knew I'd locked, was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside, the same dim, sickly glow I'd seen in the kitchen. It seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, as if the house were alive, waiting, daring me to come back. I tried to look away, to get up and walk to the street, to find anyone who could help me. But no matter how hard I tried, my gaze kept drifting back to that door, and an almost hypnotic pull washed over me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the night, to understand why the house wouldn't just let me go. The words from the notebook I'd found earlier echoed in my head. "You're already part of it." A wave of dread gripped me, but I pushed it aside, telling myself I'd find somewhere else to stay, somewhere safe. But then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked back at the windows of the house, but they were black, empty. Then I felt it again, stronger this time, and I turned to look around me, scanning the shadows at the edge of the yard. And there, just beyond the fence, I saw them. Figures standing perfectly still, lining the perimeter of my yard. They were pale, barely visible in the moonlight, and their faces, they were all wrong. They were the faces from the hallway, the twisted expressions layered on top of each other, just like I'd seen in that final vision of the entity. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of it. These figures were real. They were here, surrounding the house, watching me. They looked like lost souls, ghosts, or whatever you'd call them. Each one stood frozen in place, eyes wide and hollow, mouths stretched into silent screams. I couldn't tell if they were warning me or condemning me. I took a step back, feeling that same primal fear crawling up my spine, and one of them moved. It was a slight tilt of the head, as if acknowledging my presence. And then another figure did the same, and another. Slowly, each of them turned their empty eyes toward me, those gaping expressions fixed on my every move. That's when I heard the whisper, soft and barely audible, like a breeze but with words threaded through it. "Come back." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees, blending with the night. It was the same voice I'd heard in the house, twisted and dark, yet strangely familiar. The voices of those figures seemed to merge, creating a low, eerie hum that grew louder, filling the air with a relentless pull. Couldn't stand it. I turned on my heel and bolted, sprinting down the street as fast as my legs would carry me, away from the house, away from the figures. But as I ran, the streetlights above flickered and dimmed, one by one, casting the road into darkness. The voices grew louder, almost chanting now, urging me to come back, to return to the place I just barely escaped. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station several blocks away, where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, steady glow. I stumbled through the doors, breathless, disoriented, as the clerk behind the counter looked up, his eyes narrowing in concern. "You all right?" he asked, his voice pulling me back to reality. I opened my mouth to respond, but I didn't know what to say. How could I even begin to explain? Instead, I just nodded, catching my breath as I glanced out the gas station's front window. The house was too far away to see from here, but the memory of those figures, those empty faces watching me, was burned into my mind. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in the gas station lot. I watched the sun rise, felt the relief of dawn spreading warmth over the town, convincing myself that whatever I'd experienced was over. But when I drove back to the house the next morning, there was something waiting for me. A small envelope taped to the front door. My hands trembled as I took it down, breaking the seal, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but the words were clear enough to make my blood run cold. You left last night, but you didn't leave alone. They're with you now. You're theirs. I dropped the note, backing away from the door. I glanced around the neighborhood, expecting to see the shadowed figures lingering in the daylight, watching me. But there was no one, just me, standing alone on my doorstep, clutching the remnants of what little sanity I had left. As I turned to get back in my car, my gaze drifted to the reflection in the car window. First, it was just me, pale and shaken. But then, slowly, other faces appeared, layered over mine, faces I didn't recognize, hollow and twisted, staring back at me with an eerie, knowing grin. I staggered back from the car, my heart racing. The faces in the reflection lingered for a moment, their hollow eyes locked onto mine, before they faded away, leaving only my pale, haunted expression staring back. It took every ounce of willpower I had to steady myself and get into the car, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't go back into the house. So I started driving, aimlessly, just trying to put distance between myself and whatever had latched onto me. As I drove, flashes of last night flooded my mind. The twisted figure, the tapping in the walls, that eerie whisper calling me back. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my skin prickling with the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the back seat, or worse, those faces staring back at me again. But the mirror showed nothing except the empty road stretching out behind me. After what felt like hours, I found myself parked at a diner on the outskirts of town. It was small and run down, but it was bathed in daylight, and that was enough to make me feel a little safer. I slid into a booth near the window, where I could keep an eye on my car, and ordered a coffee, hoping the warmth would chase away the chill that had settled into my bones. As I waited, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. I scanned the diner, just a couple of regulars at the counter, a tired waitress refilling mugs, nothing out of place. But then, my eyes landed on a mirror behind the counter, and I felt that familiar chill. Reflected in the glass, I saw a shadowy figure standing just outside the diner's front door, its face obscured, but unmistakably staring right at me. My heart leapt into my throat. I whipped around to look out the window, but there was nothing there. Just my car, the empty parking lot, and the faint outline of trees beyond. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was still there, lingering just outside the door, unmoving, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. The waitress walked by, breaking my trance. "You all right, Han?" she asked, giving me a concerned look. I hesitated, glancing at the mirror again, but the shadow was gone. I managed a weak nod, forcing myself to look away from the mirror, to pretend like nothing was wrong. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and the coffee sat untouched in front of me, cooling as I tried to steady my breath. Just then, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "You can't run from them. They're part of you now." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, my heart pounding. I didn't recognize the number, and my mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been watching me? Was it some cruel prank? Or worse, was it the house itself? I grabbed the phone again, hands trembling, and typed a response, demanding to know who was sending these messages. But as soon as I hit send, the screen flickered, and the phone shut off completely. Dead. I tried turning it back on, but it wouldn't respond. Just a blank, black screen. Panic started to creep in. I didn't know where to go or who to call. The house wasn't safe, and now it seemed like even the daylight couldn't protect me. I felt trapped, cornered, and completely alone. Every sound in the diner, the clink of mugs, the hum of conversation, seemed to grow louder, distorted, pressing in on me. I had to get out. I bolted from the booth, ignoring the waitress's confused stare, and ran to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my mind racing, until the engine finally roared to life. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get as far away from here as possible. I drove until the buildings gave way to trees, following an old back road that twisted through the woods. It was quiet, isolated, with nothing but the faint rustling of leaves and the crunch of gravel beneath my tires. I pulled over, breathing heavily, hoping that the isolation would somehow free me from whatever was happening. But then I saw it, in the rearview mirror standing directly behind my car. The same shadowy figure, only this time it was closer, close enough that I could make out its shape. It was tall, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. And its face was still a blur, as though it refused to let itself be seen. I closed my eyes, hoping it was a hallucination, that the fear was twisting my mind. But when I opened them, it was there, even closer now, pressing up against the car, its face almost touching the window. A faint tapping began on the glass, the same rhythmic tapping I'd heard in the walls of the house, now echoing right beside me. Each tap felt like it was drilling into my skull, a reminder that I was trapped, that there was no escape. And then the tapping stopped. A low, raspy voice filled the car, chilling me to the bone. "Come home." The words were soft, almost tender, but they held an unmistakable threat, a command that I knew I couldn't ignore. The figure backed away, melting into the shadows, leaving me alone on the deserted road. Against every instinct screaming inside me, I turned the car around. I don't know why. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the creeping madness, or the twisted logic that returning to the house might be my only way to escape it. Maybe I just wanted it all to end. As I approached the house, dread settled over me like a heavy fog. The door was still slightly open, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the air thick with silence, the shadows stretching long and dark across the floor. The house was unchanged, yet different. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were breathing, alive. The tapping resumed, louder this time, echoing from every direction, a mocking reminder of my return. And then, the voices started, whispers, soft and insistent, coming from every corner of the room. "You're home. You belong to us now." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the floor had turned to glue, holding me in place, forcing me to listen to the voices growing louder, merging into a terrible, echoing chant. The shadows around me shifted, taking form, and I realized with horror that they were the figures from outside, the same twisted faces I'd seen in my reflection. They surrounded me, closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on me with a chilling hunger. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figures reached for me, their hands cold and clawed, pulling me deeper into the darkness. And as I felt myself being dragged down, a final whisper echoed in my mind, filling me with a cold, hollow dread. "Welcome home." And in that last moment, before the darkness swallowed me, I understood. I had never really left. I was falling. It felt endless, like being swallowed by a dark ocean, the weight pressing down on me from all sides. My senses dulled, vision blurred, and sound faded into an oppressive silence that was somehow worse than any noise. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, that thrummed in my bones, making my skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sensation stopped. I was no longer falling. I opened my eyes, slowly, warily, expecting the worst. But what I saw was my house. The same living room, the same half-unpacked boxes, the same furniture I had arranged just hours before. For a brief, disorienting moment, I thought maybe I'd blacked out, imagined everything. The figures, the whispers, the strange messages. Maybe this had all been a vivid nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then I noticed the clock on the wall. The second hand wasn't moving. I stepped closer, staring at it, willing it to tick, to confirm that this was reality. But it stayed frozen, suspended in time like the room itself. The air felt thick and stale, as if the house were holding its breath. I glanced out the window, hoping to see the world outside, some sign of life. But all I saw was blackness, a dense, impenetrable void that swallowed the edges of the house. There was nothing beyond the walls, just a vast, empty nothingness. A low hum began to fill the air, vibrating through the floor, the walls, and into my bones. It was the same hum I'd heard in the diner, the same one that had followed me all night, growing louder now, until it was almost unbearable. I covered my ears, but the sound burrowed into my skull, persistent and relentless, drowning out my thoughts. And then, over the hum, I heard the voice again. "You shouldn't have come back." I turned, and there it was, the figure standing in the doorway of the living room. His form was clearer now, less shadow and more substance. It was tall, its limbs thin and impossibly long, like a creature stretched beyond its limits. Its face was blank, featureless, except for two deep, hollow pits where eyes should have been. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. I backed away, my heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, trapping me, funneling me toward the figure as it advanced, one step at a time. I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive silence. All I could do was watch as the figure came closer, its presence filling the room, suffocating me. I felt its cold, unnatural gaze pierce through me, like it was peeling away the layers of my mind, exposing every fear, every memory, every thought. Then it reached out. Its hand was thin, almost skeletal, with fingers that ended in dark, claw-like nails. The hand hovered inches from my face, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze, caught in its grip. The figure leaned closer, and for the first time, I saw its mouth. A thin, dark line that stretched across its face, opening slowly to reveal rows of jagged, sharp teeth. It smiled, a grotesque, mocking smile that sent waves of terror through me. "You're home," it whispered, its voice like nails scraping against metal. "You're one of us now." With a sudden jolt, I felt myself being pulled forward, drawn into the figure, into the darkness of its hollow eyes. My vision blurred, the room fading away, replaced by a swirling void of shadows and whispers. I could feel myself slipping, my thoughts unraveling, merging with the darkness, becoming part of it. In that final moment, as I felt myself dissolve, I realized what the house wanted. It wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that fed on fear, on souls. Everyone who had ever lived there, everyone who had ever entered, had become part of it. Their spirits trapped, their lives consumed, bound to the walls and floors, forever lost. And now I was one of them. As my consciousness faded, I felt a presence beside me. A soul, like mine, bound to the house, whispering in the darkness. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their despair, their hopelessness, and I understood that I was now just another voice in the chorus of the lost. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a single thought surfaced. A warning, a message, echoing through the void. A last desperate plea to anyone who might hear it. "Don't stay. Don't ever come here. Run. Before it's too late." But it was too late for me, and soon it would be too late for the next one. I don't know how long I drifted in that void, lost in the dark, disembodied and weightless. Time didn't exist there. Minutes, hours, days. They all melted together into an endless, hollow silence. I was trapped, suspended in nothingness, surrounded by the faint whispers of others who had been caught in the house's grasp long before me. Their voices were faint, broken fragments of what they once were, each one carrying a lingering sadness, a desperate warning that had come too late. Every so often, I could feel a pull, a faint tug that would jolt me from the void, drawing me closer to the edges of consciousness, back toward the house. It was like a pulse, a heartbeat that reverberated through the shadows, pulling us, the lost souls, in and out of reality, as if feeding off us in waves. Then, one day, or what I think was a day, I felt something different. There was a sharp, electric crackle, a shudder that rippled through the darkness, and suddenly I was aware of everything. The void around me began to dissolve, replaced by a flickering, dim light. I could feel the pressure of walls again, the sensation of standing on solid ground. I was back in the house. I found myself in the living room, the same room where it had all started. The furniture was still half unpacked, the boxes scattered around the floor as if I'd never left. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a terrible dream, if I'd somehow fallen asleep and woken up here again. But then I noticed the air. It was colder, heavier, thick with an unnatural stillness that prickled my skin. The room wasn't empty. In the corner, shrouded in shadow, I saw a figure, a new one. They were crouched on the floor, surrounded by boxes and furniture, their face hidden as they rummaged through their things. It was someone else, a stranger who had just moved in. A sinking realization washed over me. They had come to the house. I wanted to scream, to warn them, to tell them to leave, but I was voiceless, just a faint, powerless presence trapped in the walls. I was no longer myself. I was part of the house now, bound to its dark will, a silent observer with no way to intervene. The figure stood up, glancing around the room with a wary expression. They looked as uneasy as I had felt when I first arrived, as if they could sense something lurking just beyond the edge of sight. They paused, their gaze settling on a mirror hanging in the hallway, and I watched as they approached it, drawn to their own reflection. In the mirror, I could see them clearly. An ordinary person, someone with hopes, fears, and dreams just like me. I could feel their heartbeat, their nervousness, as if it were my own. And then, as they stared into the glass, something shifted. Their reflection changed. Slowly, a shadow crept over their features, twisting them, warping their face into a distorted version of themselves. Their mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, their eyes darkening, hollowing out into empty pits. It was a reflection of what they would become, what the house would make of them if they stayed. I wanted to scream, to reach out, to do anything to make them see what was happening. But all I could do was watch helplessly as their expression flickered between confusion and horror. They stepped back, tearing their gaze away from the mirror, shaking their head as if trying to shake off a bad dream. But I knew it was only the beginning. The house had chosen them, and it wouldn't let them go. They would stay, drawn in by the invisible pull, trapped by the same malevolent force that had claimed me. And soon, they would hear the tapping in the walls, the whispers in the night, the figures in the shadows. They would search for explanations, trying to make sense of the strange happenings, until the house had wormed its way into their soul, binding them to its dark purpose. As they walked down the hallway, I felt the faint, lingering echoes of those who had come before me, those who had tried to resist but ultimately failed. We were all part of the house now, bound together in a chorus of silent screams, a warning that would never reach the ears of the living. The new resident disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, and I felt myself fading again, pulled back into the walls, into the void. But just before the darkness swallowed me completely, I heard it, the first soft, hesitant taps of footsteps echoing down the stairs, and the familiar low whisper that had once called to me. Welcome home. The house had its next victim, and soon they would join us in the endless night, just another whisper in the darkness, another lost soul bound to the walls. It was only a matter of time. Time didn't exist in the same way for me anymore, not since I had become part of the house. Days and nights melted together, stretched out into an endless, gray fog of awareness. I was there, but not there, stuck in the walls, the floors, the mirrors, trapped in every inch of this cursed place. I was conscious, but powerless, condemned to watch as the house ensnared yet another victim. I could feel the new residents' presence move from room to room, sense their footsteps vibrating through the floorboards, feel their breath stirring the stale air. They spent their first few days unpacking, oblivious to the way the shadows twisted around them, the way the house seemed to swallow each sound they made. I could sense their unease growing as the house started its familiar game. The soft taps in the walls, the doors creaking open on their own, the faint whispers just out of earshot. One evening, the new resident stopped in front of a mirror in the hallway, the same one where I had once seen my own reflection twist into something dark and hungry. I could feel them staring, could sense their confusion as their reflection began to shift, their face stretching into a silent scream. For a moment, I thought they would see me, that they'd realize I was here, trapped behind the glass, trying to warn them. But they just blinked, shook their head, and walked away, leaving me behind. The house wasted no time after that. I felt it stir, the walls tightening, the air thickening with that familiar oppressive energy. It was preparing to consume them, to draw them deeper, like it had done to me. And I could only watch, a helpless passenger, as the house began its slow, inevitable work. One night, when the air was thick and the sky outside was pitch black, I felt it start in earnest. The resident was in bed, finally drifting off to sleep after hours of tossing and turning, when the tapping started. It was subtle at first, a soft, rhythmic knock that seemed to come from within the walls. They sat up, squinting into the darkness, their eyes wide, trying to pinpoint the source. But the house was clever. It kept the noise moving, shifting from one wall to another, never staying in one place for long. As they searched, I could feel their heartbeat quicken, their breath come faster. I wanted to scream, to tell them to leave, to run before it was too late. But I was voiceless, invisible, a mere echo in the walls. They were on their own, just like I had been. Then the whispers began. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, like a breeze brushing against the walls. Words drifted through the darkness, fragmented and broken, but enough to send a shiver down their spine. Welcome, come closer, stay. I could feel the residents' fear growing. An electric hum that fed the house made it stronger. I felt the walls pulse, the floor creak under the weight of something unseen, as if the house were shifting, breathing. And then, in the silence that followed, I felt the figure, the same one that had come for me, stir from its place in the shadows. It started in the hallway, where I could feel its presence seep into the air like smoke. The new resident didn't see it at first. They were too busy searching the room, eyes darting from corner to corner, waiting for the next sound, the next whisper. But the figure was patient. It moved slowly, almost casually, its limbs long and twisted, its face hidden in the darkness, waiting just outside the edge of the resident's vision. When they finally turned, they froze, their face going pale as they saw it. A shadow standing in the doorway, tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted, hollow eyes watching, waiting. They didn't scream. They didn't move. They just stared, trapped by the figure's gaze, their breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The figure took a step forward, and then another, closing the distance, its form shifting and bending as if it were made of smoke and shadow. The resident backed away, bumping into the wall, their eyes wide with terror as the figure loomed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on them, that same grotesque smile stretching across its face. And then, just as it had with me, it whispered, "You're home." The resident bolted, darting down the hallway, stumbling as they tried to make their way toward the front door. I felt a flicker of hope. They still had a chance. They could escape, break free from the house's grip before it was too late. But the house wasn't going to let them go so easily. As they reached the door, I felt the walls tighten, the air growing thick and heavy, pressing down on them. They struggled with the lock, their hands shaking, but the door wouldn't budge. I could feel the house feeding off their panic, their desperation, savoring it, growing stronger with each passing second. And then, slowly, the figure appeared in the shadows behind them, its empty eyes watching as they struggled, its form twisting and stretching, filling the hallway. The residents' breath came in gasps as they turned to face it, realizing they were trapped, that there was nowhere left to run. I could feel their fear, sharp and electric, and I knew what was coming. They would fight, resist, try to escape. But the house was patient. It would wait, wear them down, pull them deeper into its dark embrace. And eventually, they would become like me. A voice in the walls, a shadow in the mirror, a faint, helpless whisper in the endless night. As they